Hey, it's Roland again, and you're gonna die someday, and that's okay. Death is the unifying experience. Many argue its presence is what gives life its beauty. It will happen to all of us whether we are ready for it or not. No matter who we are or what we have done, it does not discriminate. So is it useful for us to ascribe a moral implication to any instance of death? No. But it's fun. It's muddy to try and think of death as an earned consequence for someone's actions, and I do not recommend practicing that in real life. Do you deserve to die? No. Does Al from Toy Story 2 deserve to die? Yes. Look at us. We're having so much fun watching The Little Mermaid. Oh, God! The death of the Disney villain. It's a moment we have to reckon with. We can't treat it like a throwaway bit to tie a neat bow on a story like other animated movies tend to. This may be hundreds of kids' first experience with death. Do we trust Disney to handle this crucial moment with elegance and care 100% of the time? Let's hear them out. I'm in a bit of a Disney kick right now. Not the fun kind where I have the money to go to Disneyland every few months, the unfun kind where I just binge C-tier Disney films on Disney Plus while contemplating my mortality. Oh, you too? Death has an interesting relationship with the Disney formula. Interesting in that it's practically baked in. The death of a character's parents to make them feel alone, the death of a character's friends to make them feel sad, the death of Gurgi to waste our fucking time. Disney is far from the only studio that uses death as a trope, but damn do they use it quite a bit for being a studio primarily directed at kids. They've become famous for their often unsettlingly grim depictions of death and its effect on people. Bambi's mom and Mufasa probably being the most well-known, but villain deaths just hit different. Seeing their time on Earth cut short just gives me great joy. And you can quote me on that. Now, death, of course, is not the only option for a Disney bad guy, but when they do meet their grisly end, it just seems as though we can't help but be fixated on it. We've all likely seen those compilation videos on YouTube, all Disney villain defeats and deaths or what have you. A nice 20 minutes of seeing lives end as they fail to achieve their dreams. God bless America. These can get millions of views, and of course they do. We as a society have always been morbidly fascinated with death. It's the morbid fascination, but also it's the best part of the movie. It's the most cathartic. It's the resolution of the conflict. It's the moment the hero's biggest obstacle finally topples over and we get to breathe a sigh of relief knowing everything will be okay, at least from now to the credits. In our own world, where we can get overwhelmed seeing evil people get away with so much, it feels all nice and good inside to see them get their just desserts on the big screen. However, I can't help but look at Clayton's lifeless body hanging in the trees and wonder, was that necessary? This brings us to our question of the hour. Do Disney villains deserve to die? The short answer, nah. Long answer, nah. A lot of Disney films, especially nowadays, find good and creative ways to make sure the villain gets properly reprimanded without resorting to murder, so why even consider death as an option for disposing of a villain? The writers can make anything happen, why not just give them all redemption arcs? Well, for one, that would completely ruin the stakes of any movie if we just knew that the villain was going to give up by the end. The main task of a movie's ending, if the writers want it to be a satisfying conclusion, is to convince the audience that Evil McEvil Pants over here won't be a repeat offender. And hey, a corpse can't break the law. You cannot quote me on that. We should consider other options than death for the baddies, though. If for no other reason, then death is something you do not want to oversimplify. These are movies directed at children. You have to assume that at least somebody watching will be introduced to death as a concept through it. You don't want to treat it flippantly when it could have such a profound impact on a young life. You also cannot operate under the assumption that the audience will assume that death means the same thing in an animated movie as it does in real life, or even a live-action movie. A film with talking animals or superheroes, or one that takes place in a fantasy land, already invites the audience to let go of reality. You have to reteach us what death means to this rat in this world right now, otherwise the entire act will be cloudy and leave us confused. This is something that Disney considers optional. The permanency of death also immediately heightens the stakes of a film. If Elmer Fudd shoots Daffy and he gets right back up, we laugh. If Elmer Fudd shoots Daffy and we have a 5-minute funeral sequence, we'll probably still laugh. That's a bad example. All this to say, having death even be present in your movie requires you to critically contextualize the whole world you're building to make sure that moment hits exactly the way you intended to. And I think some animated movies forget that little detail. Like, I haven't seen Rio 2, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say showing this dude in jail or something would have worked just as well, if not better, than showing his dead body inside a fucking snake. I guess you gotta get your trauma somewhere, but not Rio 2. So often, it is better to let the villain walk by the end of the movie. Does that mean that death is off the table? Hell no! Movies are meant to stretch our minds, open our imaginations to extreme interpretations of reality, so sometimes the bad guy's gotta die in a fiery explosion. I am by no means saying this is a bad thing. I love it, actually. I just want animation studios to take it seriously and not just throw it in willy-nilly. And since most studios lead by Disney's example, we'll go after them.
Not the sequels, maybe some other time. I am including Pixar though, mainly because I want to talk about Syndrome.
So the game is set. Let's go through the many different ways in which Disney villains bite the dust and see if they deserved it or see if they didn't. Spoiler alert for all of the Disney movies and the Pixar movies. If you're waiting to figure out what happens to Hopper in A Bug's Life for whenever you see it for the first time, go watch that first. But don't get too attached. So this is to say, I plan on going through as many of the Disney and Pixar movies as possible to try and find common themes and details that will help give us a further understanding of what makes a more deserved villain death and what doesn't. Now granted, the conundrum of what makes someone deserve death has puzzled real-world politicians for years, so I figure it'll take us 20 minutes to bash out. But first,
let's have a brief look at what other options they use for punishing the bad guys first. If for no other reason, then a lot of these villains don't do anything remotely bad enough to warrant death. Would Finding Nemo have been better if they threw Darla off a building?
don't answer that.
The stereotypical non-lethal ending for a villain is the tried and true exit pursued by dangerous thing. Captain Hook vanishes into the sunset pursued by the crocodile. Shere Khan runs away with fire stuck to his tail. Sid gets chased by his sister, who I believe is named Hannah. This is a good way of convincing the audience that the villain won't be stirring up any more trouble. They're over there now. They can't come back here. That's not how it works. There's also prison, like Prince John and Robin Hood, Human Ratigan and Pocahontas, Bellwether and Zootopia. Gantu doesn't go to prison, he just kind of gets fired. They can get fired or removed from their position of power or just plain not get what they want, like the evil stepmother in Cinderella. Of course, a movie without a clear antagonist doesn't really fall into the jurisdiction of what we're talking about here. The bad guy in Brother Bear, I guess, would be Denahi, but that's only on technicality. He's not actually a bad person, he's just confused, so it would be weird if he died. I'm not gonna list everyone for this category. Basically, if the villain doesn't pose much of a threat, or is sufficiently incapacitated, literally or socially by the end, they can usually escape the guillotine. I wanted this to be its own category because I find it so interesting when the writers decide that death isn't enough. Disney does not make common practice of issuing a fate worse than death. The only clean example I can think of is Jafar, if you ignore the sequels, which I do. You could say Lampwick from Pinocchio, and that certainly is a fate worse than death, but Lampwick isn't really a villain, he's just an ass.
I'm not even sorry.
A wild card I'm gonna throw in is Butler What's-His-Name from Aristocats. He was probably locked in that trunk for days, weeks maybe, and even if he got out, he probably wished he was dead. When you really boil it down, he probably got worse off than most Disney villains, and he didn't even kill anybody. I did not expect that from you, Aristocats. I'm impressed. It's a bummer you're racist. Funnily enough, you could put Toy Story 1, 2, and 3 into this category. Sid is emotionally scarred forever, Stinky Pete's gonna get drawn on or something, and Lotso gets to endure pure, unbridled torture for the rest of his life, which I think is eternity. You could also say Randall in Monsters, Inc. since he's exiled to the human world, but I would say that's a bit of a stretch. I am gonna throw Chick Hicks from Cars here because that confetti cannon looked painful, and I'm also gonna throw in Ego from Ratatouille because if there's one thing that's worse than death, it's nostalgia. Who else? That one girl from Chicken Little? Yeah. I promise I'll be quick, but I have to address this. Are certain villains even capable of dying?
No, they're drawings.
We could go on all day about whether or not these fictional characters can actually die, or if death means the same thing to them that it does for us, but the only ones I'm entertaining are Hades and Otto from WALL-E. Hades is a god, he is immortal, and while he is dragged to the depths of the dead, this does not mean that he is dead. Otto opens the floodgates of whether artificial intelligence is considered a life, but the main reason I'm convinced that he can't die, or at least he doesn't die here, is because someone could easily turn him back on. There's nothing in the movie that explicitly implies that this action ends his life, or even causes him to lose consciousness. Fate worse than death? Fate worse than life? I am not considering the Alice in Wonderland characters because that's complicated. If they were figments of her imagination, does her waking up make them die? Do they continue to exist in her subconscious? Were they real all along?
We haven't even started yet.
And finally, I am not considering Ernesto from Coco for this category. While he is technically already dead, in the terms of the world of the movie, the true death would be fading away when forgotten, which could still happen to him. So, for all intents and purposes, any villain other than Hades and Otto will be assumed to be capable of dying. Another name for this category would be sequel prep. Basically, the writers leave enough of a villain's final scene to interpretation where we're probably supposed to believe that they died, but if they show back up in the next movie, it would still make sense. For example, many people assume Captain Hook is supposed to get eaten by the crocodile off screen, but he shows up in Return to Neverland unharmed. This is less a category in itself and more a modifier you can put onto a death scene to question its legitimacy. The tricky thing about plausible deniability is that technically any death could be denied unless we outright see a corpse, and they sure don't like showing corpses of the villains. Heroes though, that's fine. Villains have a nasty habit of escaping certain death for no reason at all. If the Joker from the animated series went through any of these, he'd be just fine. So you could make an argument for any death. Maybe the hyenas just stopped eating Scar. Maybe Ursula just got a tummy ache. You're gonna have a hard time with this one, but you could try. You could cast doubt on any of these deaths if you really wanted to, but the ones I feel most comfortable slotting here are Fox and the Hound, The Rescuers, Lady and the Tramp, and Coco. Lady and the Tramp and Fox and the Hound just don't show what happened to the rat and the bear respectively, so I could just as easily believe they limped away or something.
I was wrong, I'm sorry.
The Rescuers heavily implies that Madame Medusa fell victim to the crocodiles, but not enough. I could see a number of ways they would try and say she escaped this. Coco is multi-layered. Does anything happen to Ernesto when the bell falls on him? It is implied that people took him off their ofrendas, but they still remember him, so does he fade away? Probably not within the movie. I'm gonna be honest, I fucking hate plausible deniability. I hate it when the writers intentionally make it a, oh, did they really die? Just make a choice, damn it. Stop being wishy-washy. Del Toro throws someone off a cliff, you're hearing a crunch. Okay, maybe don't do that.
All right, you have been so patient. Time for some death.
This category sounds the coolest, but it's very easy to get wrong. These are the deaths that just kinda happen, none of the characters really contribute. I call them act of gods mainly because the two biggest examples, the Evil Queen in Snow White and Frollo and Hunchback, really seem to have fallen victim to legitimate divine intervention. I mean, a bolt of lightning and a gargoyle coming to life and practically dragging you to hell after you literally say,
"And he shall smite the wicked and plunge them into the fiery pit."
Ooh, the subtlety is making me antsy.
The only other death I would put here is Ratigan. Basil looks smug like he planned to have Ratigan on this specific part of the clock at the moment it chimed all from the beginning, but I call bullshit. The act of God is usually reserved for the nastiest of nasties, those villains who just enjoy being wicked so much that the universe has to self-correct and remove them from it. Does this justify a death? Honestly, I don't think it does, but I do appreciate the strong creative choice. There is nothing wishy-washy about Frollo's death. I can respect an act of God death, but only if the bad guy is especially bad. I mean, would Finding Nemo have been better if Darla got struck by lightning?
Maybe.
Self-sabotage is fun. It's probably the most poetic death that can befall a baddie. It's when the villains take things just a bit too far. They get too manic and careless, and the result is their cruel comeuppance. Gaston had full opportunity to leave when the beast spared him, but chose to stab him in the back. He loses his grip and plummets to his death. Probably. Sykes from Oliver and Company goes to extreme lengths to try and kidnap a child, chooses to drive on the train tracks, and then has the fucking gall to stare at the train and be like, well, how did that get here? McLeach had a chance to pull himself to shore, but decided to gloat for a bit, and of course, the most famous of this category, and probably the most famous villain death in general, our old friend Clayton. Oh wait, plausible deniability. He's just taking a nap. Clayton outlines the main appeal of self-sabotage from a narrative standpoint. It articulates the inevitable conclusion to good versus evil. Good persists, and evil will eventually consume itself. The main aspect that distinguishes self-sabotage is that the hero has no part in the villain's demise. Often they try to prevent it. Tarzan, for example.
Wait, don't!
It's a great way to cement your hero's pure heart while still getting rid of the baddie. However, we must be very clear on what constitutes hero intervention. Tarzan does bring down the vines that inevitably hang Clayton, so is he partially responsible?
No.
Bernard pushes McLeach into the water knowing the current is going towards a waterfall. Is he responsible?
Depends on how good his lawyer is.
The linchpin of self-sabotage is that the villain takes a step too far, and that step results in their destruction. Which means this is probably the best justification for a villain death. It acknowledges the gravity of death while not fully robbing it of its randomness. It offers the conclusion that evil behavior is inherently destructive, and when left unchecked, it will consume its host like a parasite. I think self-sabotage is my favorite way of disposing of an enemy, which is why it surprises me that Disney does it so infrequently. Well, actually, I should say they do true self-sabotage so infrequently, because for some reason they seem to favor
There's a lot of murder.
Don't get me wrong, a vast majority of Disney villains live to see the end of the movie. But if they die, then odds are the hero straight up kills them. It ain't even close. So many villains have their lives ended by the heroes. Maleficent stabbed, Ursula impaled, Shan Yu exploded, General Guy from Atlantis cut by Milo, turned into a blue guy, then exploded, Scroop from Treasure Planet kicked into space, Oogie Boogie skinned alive. Now, I'm not saying that murder cannot be justified.
Let me rephrase that.
They usually do their best to put the protagonists into situations where we understand why they have to take such drastic action. Usually, if I don't kill them, they'll kill me, or even they'll destroy the whole fucking world. But I did not expect it to be the standard way of dealing with them. Now, as is custom at this point, there are gray areas and room for debate. I may just be a bit more liberal with what I consider murder. Mother Gothel from Tangled, for example, you could just call self-sabotage since she extended her life past its natural end, so her demise was an inevitability. But Flynn makes the decision to cut Rapunzel's hair knowing it will at least render her unable to extend her life any further. That, and you have Pascal tripping her out the window, that's enough for me. Murderer. Syndrome is murdered. Mr. Incredible launches a car at him. It's not like he expected anything else to happen. Louis from Meet the Robinses murders the bowler hat by retroactively not creating it. King Candy from Wreck-It Ralph, I'm calling murder. Ralph knew he was a bug at that point and still erupted the volcano. These charges are going to sound really weird in court. Dr. Facilier... oh boy. He's messy, but I'm calling it murder. You could argue self-sabotage. His death is the natural consequence of his choice to make a deal with the underworld, but Tiana chose to destroy the medallion, and while I'm sure she didn't know that it would kill him, she did do it to cause him some ill, so that would at least qualify her for second-degree murder. And while it's not necessarily a traditional death, since he is dragged straight from one world to another, he does straight up get a headstone, so at least to this world, he is dead. The point of debate is how accountable we should hold Tiana for it. Her breaking the medallion directly led to his demise, but it was carried out by the underworld spirits. Are they legally considered a separate entity or an extension of Tiana's action? Are they subject to a different legal system altogether since they are not of this world?
Would it technically be an act of God?
You can very easily twist your head into a pretzel over this. The courtroom analogy complicates things. Legally speaking, Tiana, along with all our murderous heroes, would get off with self-defense. For our purposes, it's more a distinction of the hero taking part in the death, so Dr. Facilier fits into the murder category most comfortably. But I understand if you disagree. There is so much murder, though, and a lot of it is in cold blood. I'm giving Jack Skellington a superlative for best line said while committing murder.
How dare you treat my friend so shamefully!
I'm giving Mulan a superlative for highest body count, and I'm giving Murloc from the DuckTales movie a superlative for stupidest death noise. There are some I don't recognize as murder that you could make an argument for. I talked about McLeach from Rescuers Down Under, and I also wouldn't consider the Horned King from Black Cauldron a murder. He just kinda got too close to the cauldron cause he's dumb. I don't feel like the heroes really contributed. I would like us to consider Butler What's-His-Name from Aristocats for murder though, because there is a good chance that he died. So now that we know that a vast majority of Disney villain deaths are murders, how are we going to sleep at night?
Soundly.
The reason this is most interesting to me is because going in, I felt that a death that directly involved the hero would be the hardest to justify. So, just how do they justify these deaths?
Not very well.
These deaths usually occur when the hero is backed into a corner. There is no other option and the villain shows no sign of relenting, so if for nothing else than self-preservation, the hero has to do something. At least that's how it's supposed to be. That's how we're supposed to feel when this happens, but I don't know. I can't help but feel that not everyone exercise all their options. At the very least, the hero taking any part in the death of a villain offers the potential for the audience to leave the theater wondering if that action was justified, which is really bad if that was not intentional. So, I have reviewed and categorized all villain deaths. I didn't mention all of them because some are pretty straightforward. Where do you think Hopper ends up?
Act of God is not off the table.
I have now watched too many Disney movies and noticed commonalities in the fatalities, so now I must revisit the question, do Disney villains deserve to die?
Give me a minute.
I am being as honest as I can possibly be when I say that after looking at all of these deaths with a more critical eye, at least by my approximation, I think a vast majority of them were not as earned as they could have been. which I kinda expected. The most common justification they try to pull to set the stage for a villain's demise is them taking another life. Scar kills Mufasa, so karma gets him. Clayton kills Kerchak, etc., etc. At base level, this seems very logical, but an eye for an eye is famously flimsy philosophy, so the common answer to that is to up the ante. Syndrome wipes out dozens of heroes. McLeach has killed dozens of animals, so that tips the scales against them. This is definitely better, but I would also say that deciding how many deaths warrant further death doesn't seem like the most kosher practice. So the writers try to show that the villain will continue to misbehave. Syndrome shouts,
"This isn't the end of it! I will get your son eventually!"
King Candy declares game over, as well as his intent to take over the whole arcade. He must be stopped. This, I think, is very important. You don't want to kill a villain after they've given up, unless you want to make the hero become the villain, which, hey, that would be a really cool bait and switch. Another way they justify it is the cautionary tale. Don't be like Gaston, kids. Work on your grip. It makes sense to show the character doing bad things to have bad things happen to them. That teaches kids to not do bad things, but what happens when they look in the real world and see that not happening to bad people? What's stopping them then? I guess what I really crave is for a villain to not feel like a checklist. I'm sick of a villain that just goes through the motions. Hot take incoming. Dr. Facilier. Dr. Facilier has the villain swagger, he has the ruthlessness, he has the kick-ass song, the scary voice, the magic, and the intent to use it for evil. He really isn't particularly involved in the action, though. We get to Act 3 and it feels like they have to play catch-up with him being nasty to earn his death. He doesn't feel like a fully realized character who has been corrupted by power, going through a compelling arc of what effect that has on him and others. He just kind of feels like evil guy doing evil things because he is evil, and that is it. That's just my opinion, but it outlines the problem with villains' deaths. It should never, under any circumstances, feel like the thing to do. It shouldn't feel like, oh, we gotta do something with the bad guy, just throw him off a building. And Disney is guilty of this a lot more than I remembered. However, they do have really good examples of villain deaths. I like Gaston's demise. He just can't help himself. His ego is too out of hand. Of course he does the stupid, dangerous thing to try and play hero. I love Clayton's death. I wish he had more to do within the movie as a whole, but that sequence between him and Tarzan is so delicately crafted, you can't help but be on the edge of your seat. On the flip side, there is plenty of time when a Disney villain does not die when I'm equally satisfied. I liked Big Hero 6 and its message of resisting the urge of violent revenge. I also like Captain Hook being chased into the sunset.
What I'm realizing is that my initial question, do Disney villains deserve to die, has two pillars, and the one I've been so focused on is the historical pillar. Historically, in the Disney canon, I would say only a handful of villain deaths are truly deserved, narratively speaking. The rest are just glossed over or a huge tonal shift that doesn't feel really supported in any way. The other pillar is more of a future pillar. Do those villains whose stories haven't been written yet deserve to die? Or another way of putting it would be, should Disney villains die? And my answer is yes.
I've talked about how delicate death is in movies like this. Think of the children and all that. Do not misconstrue that to mean we need to shelter kids from death. I do not want Disney movies to err on the side of caution and let their villains get off with a warning because they were afraid of scaring little Tommy 2-year-old. If the villain is bad and you think the only way to restore order in the world of your movie is to end their life, do it. Be very deliberate, make sure you know what you're signing up for, but do it. Ideally, it has to have some edge of self-sabotage. I think that's the cleanest category to pull inspiration from, but I don't think we can overlook murder.
I gotta stop saying murder.
A hero can take action to end a villain's life. I love Syndrome's death because it isn't treated like this wonderful, awesome thing Mr. Incredible did. It was just he had enough and was going to put an end to it. And the metaphor of throwing the nice car that symbolizes the life he thought he wanted is a nice touch too. You can have your hero kill the villain. I honestly don't think I would be so critical of this if villains' deaths weren't so often immediately followed by dance parties.
So to clarify what I mean by all of this, and I doubt there are any Disney writers watching, but maybe some of you have stories that you want to get onto page or screen. If you want to kill a villain, do it. Give it some time, give it some love. You're adding a huge weight into your movie, and in these movies' cases, that can completely offset the tone, but with the right amount of care, you can make that moment just as impactful, just as human as a tender moment between two lovers. That's my take.
Doggy, who died and made me film critic? At the end of the day, do what you want. Be smart about it. Or not, what do I care? Beyond the deep shit, I just think it's fun to put all these moments side by side and see what we can learn about the movie biz as a whole. Did you know that DreamWorks is actually a lot more forgiving of its villains? Very few of them die, but most of their villain deaths can be accounted for in their most successful film franchises: Shrek, How to Train Your Dragon, and Kung Fu Panda. I'm not saying that means anything, but I'm not saying that.
I think I've said my full piece. Let me know if you agree, but more importantly, let me know if you disagree. And a fun exercise you can play now is which Disney villains who didn't die would you kill if you got the chance? I have mine. out.